noise of the world behind. Night was quiet. The wind moved gently across the dry hills of Judea, while above the earth stretched a dark sky filled with countless stars. Somewhere in the distance, shepherds watched over their flocks, and small oil lamps flickered softly behind the windows of humble homes. It was a world of simple people. People who rose with the sun each morning and entrusted their lives to God each night. A world of prayer, a world of psalms sung beside the fire, a world where fathers told their children stories of prophets and reminded them that a man who walks too far from God can easily lose his way. And yet, even in such a world, the human heart remained the same as it is today. Restless, longing, searching. For since the beginning of time, mankind has struggled with the same quiet ache, the desire for something more. Some seek God, some seek themselves. And many spend their entire lives not understanding what it is they are truly searching for. There are nights when a man sits alone and begins hearing his own thoughts more clearly than ever before. And with those thoughts come questions. Does my life truly have meaning? Am I walking the right path? Why do I still feel empty, even after all I have been given? In those days, people believed that a family home was a blessing, that a father was the pillar of the household, that land passed down through generations was sacred. But even in the midst of blessings, a man can begin dreaming of leaving, because sometimes the heart of a young man starts believing that real life exists somewhere far away, beyond peace, beyond rules, beyond the ordinary. And that is where temptation begins. The temptation of freedom without limits. The temptation of a world without responsibility. The temptation to decide for oneself what is good and what is not. For thousands of years, people have left their homes for the very same reasons. They search for wealth, for excitement, for acceptance, for a place where they no longer feel lost. Yet time and time again, they discover a painful truth. A man may travel far from his home, but it is far more difficult to escape his own soul. Tonight's story is one of the most well-known parables ever told, but its power does not lie only in the story of a young man who wasted his inheritance. It is a story about the human spirit, about pride, about loneliness, about mistakes, about a love stronger than shame itself. It is the story of a man who believed the world outside his father's house could offer him greater happiness than the peace God had already placed before him. And perhaps that is why this story has survived for thousands of years. Because no matter the century, people still search for healing in places that cannot heal the heart. In those days, young men also listened to stories about distant cities, places filled with music, trade, wealth, and pleasure. Places where life seemed larger than anything they had ever known. And one young man began thinking about that world more and more. He looked at his father's fields, at the quiet life he had always known, at the endless repetition of ordinary days. Then slowly, he began believing that his life was meant to be something else. He did not yet understand that the peace he wished to escape would one day become the very thing he longed to find again. Nor did he understand that people often recognize a blessing only after losing it. There are lessons no man can learn through the words of others. Some truths are understood only in loneliness, only when the money is gone, when the voices disappear, when when all that remains is silence and the sound of one's own thoughts. But before any of that happened, the young son still believed the world lay open before him. He believed that somewhere beyond the hills waited a life greater than the one he had known. And on that very night, his heart began drifting away from home for the first time. Perhaps that is why this story feels so close to every human soul. Because every one of us has, at some point, tried searching for happiness far away from the very thing that once gave us peace. The mornings always began the same way. Before the sun had fully risen above the hills, the household was already awake. The sound of sandals against stone floors echoed softly through the home while servants prepared water and bread for the coming day. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly beneath the pale morning light, still covered in the cool breath of dawn. His father loved mornings. The old man often stood outside before anyone else had awakened, quietly watching the first light touch the earth. Sometimes he prayed softly beneath his breath. Sometimes he simply stood in silence, as though listening for something greater than the wind itself. The younger son never understood that silence. To him, the mornings felt heavy, predictable. Every day carried the same rhythm. Work in the fields, repairing fences, feeding animals, listening to the same voices, walking the same roads. And though there was peace in that life, he no longer knew how to feel it. At night, families gathered around oil lamps while elders recited psalms and stories passed down through generations. They spoke of Abraham's faith, of Moses crossing the sea, of kings who had once walked with God and kings who had destroyed themselves through pride. The younger son listened, but only with half his heart, because somewhere deep inside him, another voice had begun growing louder. A restless voice, a dangerous voice, the voice that whispers to a man, "There must be more than this." At first, the feeling came only occasionally. While working beneath the heat of the afternoon sun, he would pause and stare beyond the distant hills, wondering what existed beyond them. Sometimes travelers passed through the region on their way to larger cities. Merchants with colorful fabrics, men carrying spices from distant lands, musicians with strange instruments and stories of crowded streets lit by hundreds of lanterns. The younger son listened carefully to every word. They spoke of places where people danced through the night, places where gold changed hands daily, places where no one cared who your father was, places where a man could become whoever he wished to be. And with every story, his own life began feeling smaller. The fields that once seemed peaceful now felt confining. The quiet evenings felt empty. Even the prayers of his father began sounding distant to him, like echoes from a world he no longer fully belonged to. His older brother never seemed troubled by such thoughts. The older son worked hard from sunrise until nightfall. He respected their father, obeyed tradition, and carried himself with discipline. There was something steady about him, something rooted deeply into the earth itself. But the younger son felt different. He wanted movement. He wanted noise. He wanted to feel alive. And perhaps that is why peace sometimes becomes difficult for the human heart. Because when a person no longer recognizes the value of stillness, silence begins to feel like imprisonment. One evening, after the day's work had ended, the younger son sat alone outside the house, staring into the darkening sky. The wind carried the distant sound of sheep bells across the hills. Inside, his family prepared for supper. His father laughed softly at something one of the servants had said. The sound should have comforted him. Instead, it only deepened the strange emptiness growing inside his chest. He could not explain it. Nothing around him was truly wrong. He had food. He had shelter. He had family. He had a father who loved him. And yet his soul remained restless. That is the strange thing about the human heart. Sometimes a man can be surrounded by blessings and still feel poor inside. The younger son began imagining a different life more and more often. A life beyond rules, beyond expectations, beyond the endless repetition of ordinary days. He imagined crowded marketplaces, music echoing through city streets, beautiful clothing, wealth, freedom. Most of all, he imagined becoming someone new. Because deep down, he had started believing that his current life was too small for the person he was meant to become. And slowly, almost without noticing, gratitude disappeared from his heart. The prayers of his father no longer moved him. The peaceful evenings no longer satisfied him. Even the warmth of home began feeling like chains. And perhaps that is how many people lose themselves without realizing it. Not through hatred, not through evil, but through a quiet dissatisfaction that grows slowly over time. A belief that happiness exists somewhere else. That fulfillment is always waiting just beyond the next horizon. That the life we already have cannot possibly be enough. That night, long after everyone else had fallen asleep, the younger son remained awake beneath the stars. And for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to imagine leaving home forever. He did not yet understand what such a choice would cost him. He did not yet understand how easily the human soul can confuse freedom with escape. But deep within him, the decision had already begun forming. And though no one else could yet see it, his heart was already walking away from home. In the weeks that followed, the younger son became increasingly drawn to the travelers who passed near his father's land. Whenever merchants stopped to rest before continuing their journey south, he found excuses to linger nearby. Sometimes he carried water for them. Sometimes he helped feed their animals. But truthfully, he only wanted one thing: their stories. The travelers spoke of cities larger than anything he had ever imagined. Places where streets remained alive long after sunset. Places filled with music, perfumes, laughter, and endless movement. Places where wealthy men wore rings of silver and women dressed in fabrics dyed with colors he had never seen before. To the younger son, their words sounded almost magical. At night, while the travelers rested beside the fire, he listened in silence as sparks drifted upward into the darkness. One man spoke of markets overflowing with gold and spices from distant kingdoms. Another described musicians who played through the night while crowds danced beneath hanging lanterns. A third laughed as he told stories about rich men wasting fortunes on wine simply to impress strangers they would never see again. The younger son listened to every detail, and with every story, the quiet life of his father's house seemed to fade further into the background of his mind. The old rhythms of home no longer felt peaceful. They felt small, predictable, empty. That is one of the oldest temptations in the human soul, the belief that excitement must surely be more valuable than peace. Even during prayer, his thoughts wandered elsewhere. While his father recited sacred words at the supper table, The younger son imagined distant cities glowing beneath torchlight. While psalms were sung beside the evening fire, he imagined crowded streets filled with strangers who seemed freer than anyone he had ever known. His body remained at home, but his heart had already begun living somewhere else. One evening, an older traveler noticed the hunger in the young man's eyes. "You wish to see the world," the traveler said quietly. The younger son hesitated before answering. "Yes." The traveler smiled sadly, as though he had seen that same longing many times before. "The world is beautiful," he said, "but it is also very good at making lost people feel even more lost." The younger son barely listened, because youth often hears only the parts of wisdom it wishes to hear, and at that moment he wanted adventure more than understanding. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked beyond the fields alone. The moon hung low above the hills, bathing the earth in pale silver light. For a long time, he stood in silence, staring toward the distant roads leading away from home. He imagined himself walking those roads, leaving behind responsibility, leaving behind expectations, leaving behind the quiet life that now felt unbearably distant from the person he wished to become. And slowly, another dangerous thought entered his heart. What if his father's world was not God's blessing, but merely a prison built from tradition and fear? That thought frightened him at first. Yet the more he entertained it, the more freedom it seemed to promise. Because once a man begins believing that wisdom is oppression, he becomes willing to abandon the very things meant to protect him. In the days that followed, the younger son became increasingly distant from his family. His older brother noticed it first. The young man worked carelessly now. His thoughts drifted constantly. Sometimes he stared beyond the hills for long stretches without speaking at all. Even his father saw the change, but the old man said very little. Perhaps because fathers sometimes recognize storms in their children long before the storm fully arrives. One evening, after supper, the younger son overheard his father quietly praying alone. The old man's voice trembled softly beneath the night wind. "Lord, guide my sons when my own hands no longer can." For a moment, guilt pierced through the young man's heart, but only for a moment, because temptation rarely appears ugly in the beginning. Most often, it arrives beautifully, as possibility, as freedom, as the promise of becoming more. And so the younger son continued feeding the dream growing inside him, a dream of distant cities, of endless excitement, of a life untouched by limits. He did not yet understand that some limits exist not to imprison the soul, but to protect it from destruction. Soon, the desire to leave would become impossible to silence. And when that day came, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The morning he finally spoke to his father, the sky above the hills was gray and heavy with clouds. The younger son had barely slept the night before. For weeks, the thought had lived quietly inside him, growing stronger with every passing day. At first, it had only been a distant dream, a whisper hidden somewhere deep in his heart. But dreams, when fed long enough, eventually become decisions. And now there was no turning back. The household moved through its usual morning rhythm. Servants carried baskets of grain. Sheep wandered slowly through the lower fields. His older brother worked near the well, focused and silent as always. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 100 times before. Yet to the younger son, it all felt unbearably distant. He watched his father standing outside the house, speaking quietly with one of the workers. The old man's face carried the calm strength of someone who had spent many years trusting God through both blessing and hardship. For a brief moment, doubt entered the young man's heart. Perhaps he should remain. Perhaps this restlessness would pass. But then another voice rose inside him, the same voice that had followed him for months now. If you stay here, your life will never truly begin. And so he walked toward his father. The old man noticed immediately that something was wrong. A father often sees sorrow in his children before they are able to speak it aloud. The younger son tried to steady his breathing. Then finally, with a trembling voice, he spoke the words that had already begun separating him from his home long before this day arrived. "Father, give me the share of the inheritance that belongs to me." Silence followed. Even the wind seemed to disappear for a moment. The older brother slowly lifted his eyes from the well, staring toward them in disbelief. In those days, such a request carried enormous weight. Inheritance was not simply money. It was family, legacy, blessing, responsibility passed down through generations. To ask for it early was almost like saying, "I no longer wish to belong here." The younger son expected anger, perhaps shouting, perhaps disappointment, perhaps judgment. But his father did none of those things. The old man simply looked at him quietly, and somehow that silence hurt more than anger ever could. There was sadness in his eyes, but also understanding, as though he already knew something the younger son himself could not yet understand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the father nodded slowly, not because he wanted his son to leave, but because love cannot force a man to stay. Sometimes people must walk into the wilderness of their own choices before they are ready to return home. The younger son watched as his father turned away, carrying the weight of grief silently, without bitterness. And for the first time, guilt pierced deeply into the young man's heart. But pride is powerful. And once a man begins worshipping freedom more than wisdom, he often mistakes conviction for courage. The inheritance was divided over the following days: silver, livestock, supplies for travel. The older brother barely spoke during that time. His disappointment hung heavily in the air like an approaching storm. The younger son tried not to notice it. Instead, he focused on the future, on the roads ahead, on the cities waiting beyond the hills, on the life he believed would finally make him feel complete. Yet strange moments of sadness still found him unexpectedly. When he passed the olive trees he had climbed as a child, when he heard evening prayers drifting through the house, when he saw his father sitting alone beneath the fading light of sunset, something inside him knew he was breaking more than tradition. He was breaking trust. Still, he continued preparing to leave, because temptation rarely convinces a man all at once. It works slowly, one thought at a time, one dream at a time, one small compromise at a time, until eventually the heart becomes convinced that leaving peace behind is the same thing as finding freedom. On the final evening before his departure, the family gathered together for supper. The atmosphere was quiet. The older brother avoided looking at him entirely. The servants spoke little. Only the father remained calm. Before the meal began, the old man lifted his eyes toward heaven and prayed softly. May God guide the feet of those we love, even when they walk beyond our sight. The younger son lowered his head. Something about those words unsettled him deeply. But by then, the dream of another life had already become too strong inside him. And that night, while the rest of the house slept, he stared out into the darkness beyond the hills, wondering what kind of man he would become once he finally left home behind. He left before sunrise. The world was still covered in darkness when the younger son stepped quietly beyond the gates of his father's land. A cool wind drifted through the hills, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant rain. For a moment, he stopped walking and looked back. The house stood silent beneath the fading stars. The same home that had once protected him, fed him, loved him, now seemed impossibly far away already. Inside, his family was still asleep. Or perhaps not. Perhaps his father was awake somewhere in the darkness, silently praying for a son already slipping beyond his reach. The younger son tightened his cloak and continued walking. At first, excitement carried him forward easily. Every step felt like proof that his real life had finally begun. The road stretched endlessly before him, winding through valleys and hills he had never seen before. Travelers passed beside him with loaded carts and tired animals, each carrying stories from distant lands. For the first time in his life, the world felt enormous, and he loved it. By midday, the sun burned high above the earth. The younger son stopped beside a small stream where several travelers had gathered to rest. Some were merchants. Others were wandering laborers. One was a musician carrying an old stringed instrument across his back. Unlike his home, no one here knew his name. No one expected anything from him. And strangely, that anonymity felt intoxicating. One of the merchants asked where he was traveling. The younger son smiled. Wherever the road leads. The men laughed approvingly. To them, he looked like a young man beginning an adventure. And perhaps that is exactly what he wanted to believe. That evening, the travelers built a fire beside the road. The musician played soft melodies beneath the stars, while the others shared stories about distant cities filled with wealth and opportunity. The younger son listened carefully to every word. Somewhere deep inside him, he felt as though he had finally escaped the invisible walls of his old life. No more rules, no more expectations, no more quiet evenings listening to his father pray beside the fire. Only freedom. But freedom without direction can become a dangerous thing. The younger son did not yet understand this, because in the beginning, wandering often feels beautiful, especially to a soul that mistakes movement for purpose. Later that night, long after the others had fallen asleep, he remained awake beside the dying fire. Above him stretched a sky so vast, it almost frightened him. For the first time in many years, there was no roof above his head, no familiar sounds, no certainty about tomorrow. And yet instead of fear, he felt alive. He imagined the cities waiting ahead, the wealth he would gain, the people he would meet, the man he believed he was becoming. In his mind, the future looked limitless. He did not yet know how quickly limitless things can consume a human heart. As the fire slowly faded into glowing embers, the younger son whispered a quiet prayer into the night. Not a prayer for wisdom, not a prayer for guidance, but a prayer for adventure. And perhaps that was the beginning of his deepest mistake. Because sometimes God answers the prayers we ask for in order to teach us what we truly need. The road ahead disappeared into darkness, and somewhere beyond those distant hills, the world was already preparing to test everything the young man believed about freedom, happiness, and himself. Still, he walked forward willingly, because at that moment, he believed he was moving toward life. He did not yet realize he was also walking toward his own breaking point. The city appeared at sunrise. From the top of a dusty hill, the younger son stood silently as golden morning light spilled across massive stone walls and crowded streets below. Smoke rose into the sky from hundreds of homes and marketplaces already alive with movement. Even from a distance, he could hear it. Voices, animals, music, laughter, life. More life than he had ever seen before. His heart raced with excitement. Everything about the city felt larger than the quiet world he had left behind. Caravans moved constantly through the gates, carrying spices, fabrics, wine, silver, and goods from distant kingdoms. Rich merchants shouted over one another, while musicians played along crowded streets for coins tossed by strangers. The younger son walked through the gates slowly, overwhelmed by the endless noise and color surrounding him. Perfume and smoke filled the air. Women in brightly colored robes passed by, laughing with jeweled men whose hands glittered with rings of gold. Street vendors called out promises of pleasure and luxury. Everywhere he looked, people seemed alive with confidence. And deep inside himself, the younger son felt something dangerous awaken: envy. Not the bitter envy of hatred, but the seductive envy that whispers, "This is the life you were meant for." At first, he wandered through the city in awe. He bought expensive food simply because he could. He listened to musicians late into the night. He stayed in places far more luxurious than anything he had known before. And because he carried money openly, people welcomed him quickly. Strangers smiled at him, invited him to their tables, poured wine into his cup. For the first time in his life, he felt important, seen, desired. That feeling intoxicated him more than the wine itself, because many lonely people spend their entire lives searching for one thing above all else: to feel valued. And the city knew exactly how to sell that illusion. Days blended together quickly. Morning became evening. Evening became night. And night stretched endlessly beneath lantern light, music, and celebration. The younger son stopped praying. At first unintentionally, then completely. The psalms his father once sang now felt far away, like faint echoes from another lifetime. And slowly, almost without noticing, he stopped thinking about God altogether. Because the world becomes very loud when a man fills every moment with distraction. One evening, while walking through the crowded marketplace, the younger son paused beside a fountain overflowing with torchlight and music. Around him, wealthy men laughed loudly, while servants carried silver trays filled with food and wine. Everyone appeared happy. Yet as he looked closer, he noticed something strange hidden beneath the noise. Exhaustion, loneliness, desperation hiding behind pleasure. But the realization realization vanished quickly, because before a soul fully breaks, it often learns how to silence truth. And so the younger son continued surrendering himself to the rhythm of the city, the endless movement, the endless excitement, the endless hunger for more. He believed he had finally escaped emptiness. He did not yet realize emptiness was quietly growing inside him with every passing day. At first, the younger son believed he had finally found friendship. Everywhere he went, people welcomed him warmly. Tavern owners greeted him by name. Musicians invited him to sit beside them late into the night. Merchants laughed loudly at his jokes, even when they were not particularly clever. The city had opened its arms to him, or so he thought. The truth was much quieter than that. The city had not fallen in love with the man. It had fallen in love with what the man carried in his hands. Silver has a strange power over lonely people. It can create the illusion of belonging faster than almost anything else. The younger son did not yet understand this, and so he spent freely, at crowded tables overflowing with wine, in gambling houses thick with smoke and laughter, in marketplaces filled with rare perfumes and fine fabrics. Whenever he paid for another meal or another celebration, the people around him cheered as though he were a king. And deep inside himself, he confused attention with love. That is one of the oldest mistakes in the human heart. Many people would rather be admired falsely than seen truthfully. One evening, after another lavish gathering, the younger son walked through the city beside several men he had recently begun calling friends. They spoke endlessly about pleasure, about women, about wealth, about freedom. None of them spoke about peace. None of them spoke about God. And yet the younger son noticed something strange. Despite all their laughter, many of these men seemed deeply afraid of silence. Whenever conversation slowed, someone poured more wine. Whenever quiet approached, someone demanded music. Whenever sadness appeared in someone's eyes, the entire group buried it beneath noise and celebration. The younger son slowly began doing the same. Because distraction is often easier than honesty. At night, when he returned alone to his room, small moments of emptiness began slipping through the cracks of his excitement. He would sit beside the window, staring at the sleeping city beneath him. And for brief moments, memories returned. His father praying quietly beside the evening fire, the sound of sheep bells across the hills, the stillness of home. But he pushed those thoughts away quickly, because admitting homesickness would have felt like failure, and pride rarely allows a man to confess his loneliness honestly. So instead, he spent even more wine, more parties, more distractions. The city gladly accepted all of it, because there will always be people willing to stand beside a man while his pockets remain full. But very few remain once the silver disappears. One afternoon, while walking through the marketplace, the younger son overheard two merchants speaking quietly nearby. "That young fool spends like a prince," one of them laughed. "He will have nothing left before winter." The younger son pretended not to hear them, yet their words followed him for the rest of the day. For the first time, fear touched him. Not strong enough to change him, but strong enough to disturb his peace. That evening, surrounded by music and drunken voices, he suddenly realized something terrifying. No one in the room truly knew him. Not his fears, not his memories, not the boy he once was. They knew only the version of him built from silver and celebration. And perhaps that is why worldly attention often leaves the soul emptier than before. Because being admired is not the same as being loved. Still, the younger son ignored the warning growing inside him. Because by then, the city itself had become like an addiction. The noise, the movement, the endless stimulation. Silence now frightened him more than chaos ever could, and so he continued walking deeper into a life that looked full on the outside, while slowly hollowing him from within. He first saw her near the fountain at the center of the lower marketplace. The evening air was warm, filled with torchlight and distant music drifting through the crowded streets. Merchants were closing their stalls, while wealthy travelers gathered beneath hanging lanterns to drink and celebrate the night. And there she stood among them, calm, elegant, untouched by the noise surrounding her. Her eyes reflected the golden light of the fire beside her. And when she smiled, the younger son felt something shift inside him immediately. Until that moment, the city itself had been his greatest temptation. Now temptation suddenly had a face. She spoke softly, unlike most people in the city. While others chased attention loudly, she seemed mysterious in her quietness. The younger son found himself returning to the fountain night after night, hoping to see her again. And eventually, she noticed him too. Their conversations began simply. Questions about where he came from. Questions about his travels. Questions about the life he had left behind. At first, he avoided speaking about home, because home reminded him of the person he used to be. And by now, he was trying desperately to become someone else. The woman listened carefully whenever he spoke. Sometimes she laughed gently at his stories. Other times she simply watched him with a sadness he could not fully understand. That sadness drew him closer to her. Because lonely people often mistake emotional familiarity for destiny. Soon, the younger son began spending more time with her than anyone else in the city. He bought her expensive gifts, jewelry, perfume, silks from distant lands. Every time she smiled at him, he felt important again, chosen, special. And slowly, without realizing it, he began building his identity around her attention. That is the danger of an unguarded heart. When a man does not know his own worth before God, he often places his soul into the hands of other people. The woman never directly asked him for anything. She did not need to. The younger son offered everything willingly, because deep inside himself, he feared losing the feeling she gave him, the feeling that he finally mattered. One night, as they sat together beneath lantern light overlooking the city, she asked him quietly, "Do you ever miss your home?" The question struck him harder than he expected. For a moment, images returned vividly to his mind. The hills, his father's voice, evening prayers, stillness. But instead of answering honestly, he forced a smile. "There is nothing for me there anymore." The woman looked at him silently for a long moment. And though she said nothing, something inside him already knew he was lying. Because no matter how far a man travels, the soul remembers where it first learned peace. Still, he continued sinking deeper into the illusion surrounding him. The city, the parties, the woman beside him. Together, they formed a beautiful distraction from the growing emptiness inside his heart. And perhaps that is why temptation rarely appears ugly in the beginning. It often arrives beautifully, softly, wearing the face of comfort, desire, or love. But when a man builds his peace upon temporary things, eventually those things begin collapsing beneath him. The younger son did not yet understand this. All he knew was that he wanted the feeling to last forever. And so he kept giving pieces of himself away, without realizing how little would remain when everything finally disappeared. The seasons changed almost without him noticing. Days blurred into nights, and nights dissolved into endless celebrations beneath lantern light and music. The younger son stopped counting time entirely. He no longer lived with any thought of tomorrow, only the next meal, the next gathering, the next distraction. The silver his father had given him seemed endless at first, and because it seemed endless, he spent it carelessly. There is something dangerous about abundance when wisdom is absent. A man who has never known true emptiness often believes blessings cannot disappear. The younger son purchased finer clothing now, richer food, more expensive wine. He moved into larger rooms overlooking the city streets below. Musicians and merchants surrounded him constantly, feeding his hunger for excitement. Yet the strange thing about pleasure is that it rarely satisfies for long. What once felt thrilling soon becomes ordinary, and so the soul demands more. More noise, more attention, more stimulation. The younger son found himself chasing feelings he could no longer fully reach. Even while surrounded by people, he often felt strangely disconnected from everything around him. Sometimes he would laugh loudly with the others, while feeling completely empty inside. But instead of facing that emptiness honestly, he buried it beneath movement. Because many people fear stillness more than destruction. Stillness forces a man to hear himself clearly. One evening, after a long night of drinking and celebration, the younger son returned alone to his room. The city outside remained alive with noise, but inside the room there was only silence. He sat heavily beside the window and stared down at the crowded streets below. And suddenly, for reasons he could not explain, he felt exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. The kind of exhaustion that comes from spending too long pretending to be someone else. He thought about praying, but the words felt distant now, almost unfamiliar. How strange it is that a soul can slowly drift from God without even realizing when the distance began. The younger son lowered his head into his hands. For a brief moment, he imagined returning home, but pride immediately crushed the thought. How could he return now? What would people say? What would his brother think? No, he would continue forward. He would prove to himself that leaving had been the right decision. And so the next morning, he returned once again to the noise of the city. But something inside him had begun changing. The joy he once felt no longer came as easily. Pleasure had started feeling repetitive. Conversations felt hollow. Even laughter sounded forced. Yet instead of slowing down, he moved faster. Because a man running from emptiness often mistakes speed for healing. Soon, the money began disappearing more quickly than before. The younger son noticed it, but he ignored the warning, because by then he had built his entire identity around the life he was living. Without the city, without the attention, without the endless distractions, he no longer knew who he was. And so he kept spending, kept chasing, kept running, not realizing that every step forward was carrying him closer to collapse. The silence arrived slowly. At first, it was barely noticeable. A few invitations stopped coming. Certain faces disappeared from the gatherings. The tavern owners greeted him with slightly less enthusiasm than before. The younger son told himself it meant nothing, but deep down, anxiety had already begun growing inside him. His silver was nearly gone, and the city had started noticing. One morning, he opened the small chest where he kept the remainder of his inheritance. Very little remained. For a long time, he simply stared at it in silence. The room around him suddenly felt unfamiliar, smaller, colder. He tried pushing away the fear rising in his chest. Surely things would work out. Surely someone would help him. Surely the people who had laughed beside him night after night would not abandon him now. But the city was already preparing to teach him a painful lesson. Many relationships survive only as long as comfort remains. That evening, he walked through the streets, searching for familiar faces. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others greeted him politely, but briefly before returning to wealthier company. Even the woman with golden eyes seemed distant now. Not cruel, not angry, simply distant. As though the version of him she once admired had slowly disappeared. The younger son suddenly understood something terrifying. He had built his life among people who loved what he could provide, not who he truly was. And now that the silver was disappearing, so were they. For the first time since leaving home, the city no longer felt exciting. It felt enormous, indifferent, cold. That night, he wandered through the streets alone. The same music that once thrilled him now sounded hollow in the distance. Laughter echoed through open tavern doors while strangers celebrated lives he no longer belonged to. And for the first time in many months, he stopped running from silence. He sat beside an empty alleyway beneath the dim light of a single torch. No music, no crowds, no distractions, only himself. And in that silence, memories began returning. His father's voice during evening prayer, the smell of bread inside the family home, the calmness of the hills at sunset. He suddenly realized something painful. The peace he once rejected so casually was now the very thing his soul longed for most. Tears filled his eyes unexpectedly, not because he was poor, but because he finally understood how deeply lost he had become. There is a loneliness that comes not from being physically alone, but from realizing you no longer recognize yourself. The younger son sat in silence long into the night, and somewhere deep inside him, the first cracks of true awakening had finally begun. Hunger changes a man, not only the hunger of the body, but the hunger of the soul. By the time winter winds reached the city, the younger son had almost nothing left. The rooms he once stayed in were gone. The fine clothing had been sold. The people who once celebrated beside him barely looked at him anymore. And for the first time in his life, survival itself became uncertain. He searched desperately for work. Anything. But the city that once welcomed him so warmly now seemed unwilling to notice him at all. That is often the way of the world. It praises strength, success, beauty, wealth, but suffering frequently becomes invisible. The younger son spent entire days walking through crowded streets searching for someone willing to hire him. most ignored him. Others dismissed him immediately. At night, hunger kept him awake. Real hunger, the kind that weakens the body and strips pride away piece by piece. But an even deeper hunger had begun growing inside him. A hunger for peace, for home, for forgiveness, for God. One cold evening, he sat alone near the marketplace, watching families gather together for supper. Children laughed beside warm fires. Parents prayed quietly before meals. And suddenly, memories flooded his heart so powerfully that he could barely breathe. He remembered his father blessing the bread each evening, the calmness of home after sunset, the feeling of safety he once took for granted. And for the first time, he understood how blind he had been. He had abandoned peace because he mistook excitement for freedom. Now, excitement was gone, and all that remained was emptiness. The younger son lowered his head and wept quietly in the darkness. Not because he was hungry, but because he finally realized that the world had promised him fulfillment, while slowly draining life from his soul. And somewhere beneath the cold night sky, he began wondering if God still remembered him, even after everything he had become. The work was given to him only because no one else wanted it. Far from the crowded streets of the city, beyond the stone walls and the noise that had once swallowed his life, there was a field where pigs fed beneath the gray sky. The air there was heavy with the smell of mud, waste, and hunger. And there, among the animals, the younger son found himself. The son of a respected father. The son who had once eaten at a table blessed with prayer. The son who had once believed the world would bow before his dreams. Now he stood in torn clothing, his hands covered in filth, feeding animals that his people considered unclean. There are moments in life when a man does not simply fall. He wakes up inside the fall. He looks around and realizes that the road he once called freedom has carried him to a place he never imagined he could reach. At first, shame burned inside him like fire. He tried to tell himself this was temporary, that he would rise again, that somehow the city would open another door. But days passed, then more days, and the hunger did not leave. Sometimes he watched the pigs eating pods from the ground and felt his stomach tighten with desperation. He was so hungry that even their food began to look desirable. And that thought broke something in him. He remembered the servants in his father's house. Even they had bread. Even they had shelter. Even they were treated with dignity. But he, the son, had chosen distance over love. He had traded blessing for noise, peace for pleasure, home for illusion. The wind moved across the field, cold and merciless. He lowered himself to the ground and stared into a shallow pool of dirty water. For a moment, he did not recognize the face looking back at him. His beard was unkempt. His eyes were hollow. His skin was marked by exhaustion. And in that reflection, he saw not only what had happened to his body, but what had happened to his soul. He had become a stranger to himself. For the first time in a long time, he did not blame the city. He did not blame the woman. He did not blame his false friends. He saw the truth clearly. He had chosen this road, and every choice had carried him here. That truth was painful, but it was also the first honest thing he had allowed himself to feel in many months. Sometimes grace begins not with comfort, but with of the moment a man can no longer lie to himself. That evening, as the sky darkened above the field, the younger son sat alone among the animals. There was no music now, no laughter, no gold, no one pretending to love him, only the sound of pigs feeding in the mud. And somewhere beneath his shame, a quiet memory returned. His father's house, warm bread, clean water, a voice praying softly before the meal. For the first time, he did not remember home as a prison. He remembered it as mercy. And there, in the lowest place he had ever known, a single thought entered his heart. Perhaps he could return, not as a son. He no longer felt worthy of that, but perhaps as a servant. Perhaps his father would allow him to work. Perhaps he could live near the house, even if he could never again belong inside it. He did not yet understand the depth of his father's love, but in the mud, among the swine, he began to understand the depth of his own need. And that was the beginning of his return. That night, rain began to fall, not heavily at first, only a soft, cold rain that settled over the fields and turned the earth beneath him to mud. The younger son sat beneath a broken shelter near the place where the animals slept, wrapping his torn cloak around his shoulders. The world was dark. No lanterns, no music, no voices calling his name. Only rain. There are nights when God allows everything else to become silent so that a man can finally hear the truth. The younger son had spent so long surrounded by noise that silence felt almost unbearable. In the city, whenever sadness approached, he could drown it in music. Whenever guilt rose in his heart, he could hide it beneath wine or laughter. But there was nowhere to hide now. The rain fell steadily, and with it came memory. He remembered being a child in his father's house, waking early to the sound of workers outside. He remembered running through the olive trees. He remembered his father lifting him onto his shoulders when he was small enough to be carried. He remembered evening prayers, his father's hands raised toward heaven, his voice calm and steady, his words filled with trust. Lord, teach us to walk in your ways. The younger son closed his eyes tightly. He had once thought those prayers were chains. Now he understood they had been covering, protection. A blessing he had never valued because he had never lived without it. For the first time in many months, he tried to pray. But no beautiful words came. No psalm, no sacred phrase, no confident plea. Only brokenness. God, he whispered, and then nothing. His voice disappeared into the sound of rain. But perhaps that was enough. Because sometimes the most honest prayer is not made of many words. Sometimes it is only a heart finally turning back. He thought of his father. Had the old man cursed his name? Had he erased him from the household? Had he told the servants never to speak of him again? The younger son imagined the disappointment in his father's eyes and felt shame rise inside him so sharply that he bent forward, pressing his hands into the mud. "I am no longer worthy," he whispered. The words came slowly at first. Then again, "I am no longer worthy to be called your son." He repeated the sentence as though preparing himself for the long road home. He would say it to his father. He would not ask for restoration. He would not demand a place at the table. He would not pretend he deserved anything. He would only ask to be received as a hired servant. And strangely, The thought did not crush him. It humbled him. For the first time, he was no longer trying to become great. He only wanted to come back alive. The rain continued through the night, but something within him had changed. The field remained the same. His clothes remained torn. His hunger remained real. And yet the darkness no longer felt endless. Because repentance does not always begin with strength. Sometimes it begins with a man sitting in the ruins of his own choices, finally telling the truth. As dawn approached, the rain slowed. The younger son stood carefully, weak but awake in a way he had not been for a long time. He looked toward the road he had once taken away from home. Now it waited before him again. Only this time, it would not be the road of pride. It would be the road of return. The journey home felt longer than the journey away. When he first left his father's house, the road had seemed filled with promise. Every hill looked like an invitation. Every passing traveler seemed like a sign that life was finally beginning. But now, the same road felt heavy beneath his feet. Each step carried memory. Each mile carried shame. The younger son walked slowly, weakened by hunger and exhaustion. His sandals were worn thin. His cloak hung loosely from his shoulders. Dust clung to his skin. He no longer looked like the young man who had once left home with silver in his hands and pride in his heart. That man was gone. Or perhaps he had never truly existed. Perhaps he had only been a mask built from desire and fear. As he walked, he repeated the words again and again. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you." Then again, "I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Then again, "Make me as one of your hired servants." The words became a rhythm, a prayer, a confession. He did not know whether his father would receive him, and that uncertainty frightened him. There were moments when he almost turned back. Not because he wanted the old life again, but because shame can become its own prison. Sometimes a man would rather remain lost than face the eyes of someone he has wounded. But each time he considered stopping, he remembered the field of swine, the hunger, the mud, the silence, and he kept walking. Along the road, he passed people who barely noticed him. A few gave him curious looks. Some moved away from him because of his appearance. Others simply continued on their way. Once, a family passed by with children walking beside a donkey. The father carried bread wrapped in cloth, and before they ate, he lifted his eyes toward heaven and blessed God for the meal. The younger son had to turn away. The sight was too painful, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. And he had once despised the ordinary blessings that now seemed holy. As the sun lowered behind the hills, he stopped beneath an olive tree and rested. For a long time, he watched the road ahead. Somewhere beyond those hills was home. The thought filled him with both hope and terror. What if his brother refused to look at him? What if the servants laughed? What if his father turned away? He lowered his head. "Lord," he whispered, "I do not ask to be restored. I ask only for mercy." The prayer was simple, but it was the truest prayer he had spoken in years. And perhaps God had been listening from the beginning. Not only when he prayed with proper words, but also when he wept in silence, when he starved in a foreign land, when his pride broke, when his heart finally turned toward home. rose before sunrise and continued walking. With each step, the landscape became more familiar. The shape of the hills, the smell of the earth, the distant line of fields he once knew. His heart began to pound. By afternoon, he saw the road that led toward his father's house. He stopped. For a long moment, he could not move. The home he had abandoned stood somewhere beyond the distance, and the boy who left it was not the same man returning. He took a breath, then another, and slowly, trembling, he walked forward. Long before the younger son saw the house, the father had seen the road. He had watched it for many days, many months, perhaps longer. Each morning, when the sun rose over the hills, the father would step outside and look toward the path that led away from the land. Sometimes servants noticed him standing there in silence. Sometimes the older son passed by and said nothing. But the father kept watching, not because he knew the day of return, but because love often waits, even when reason says it should stop. The father had heard nothing from his younger son. No message, no traveler carrying news, no sign, only silence. And silence can be cruel to those who love deeply. Yet the father did not allow silence to become bitterness. He carried grief, but he did not let grief destroy compassion. He carried disappointment, but he did not let disappointment become hatred. Each evening, when the household gathered, he still prayed for both of his sons, for the one who stayed and for the one who had gone. There were nights when the father sat alone beneath the stars, remembering the boy his son once was. He remembered small hands reaching for him. He remembered laughter in the fields. He remembered the day the younger boy first tried to carry water and spilled most of it on himself. Those memories hurt, but they also kept love alive. People in nearby villages sometimes spoke in whispers. Some said the younger son had dishonored his family beyond repair. Some said no father should receive such a son again. Some said justice required distance. But the father knew something deeper than justice alone. He knew mercy. And mercy is not weakness. Mercy is strength governed by love. The father did not pretend that nothing had happened. He knew his son had sinned against the family, against heaven, against himself. But the father also knew that if his son ever returned, he would not first need a lecture. He would need arms. He would need covering. He would need to know that shame was not stronger than love. And so the father watched the road, day after day, until one afternoon, beneath the bright heat of the sun, he saw a figure in the distance. At first, it was only a small shape moving slowly along the path. A poor man, perhaps. A traveler. A servant. But something in the father's heart stirred. He stepped forward. The figure came closer. Torn clothing. Weak steps. A bowed head. Then the father knew. Age did not stop him. Dignity did not stop him. The opinions of others did not stop him. He ran across the ground, toward the road, toward the son who had broken his heart. And in that moment, before the younger son could explain, before he could finish his confession, before he could earn anything back, the father's love was already moving toward him. That is the mystery of grace. The son thought he was walking home to beg for mercy, but mercy had already begun running to meet him. The younger son saw his father running toward him and froze. For a moment, he did not understand what was happening. He had imagined many possible endings to this journey. Anger, rejection, a cold command to leave, perhaps a distant permission to work among the servants. But he had never imagined this. His father running, not walking with dignity, not waiting with folded arms, running. The sight broke something inside him. All the words he had practiced on the road rose to his lips, trembling and incomplete. "Father." But before he could continue, his father reached him and wrapped him in his arms. The younger son stood stiffly at first, as though he did not know how to receive love anymore. Then his body weakened, and he wept. Not small tears, not controlled tears. The kind of weeping that comes when a man has carried shame for so long that mercy feels almost unbearable. His father held him tightly. No question came first, no accusation, no demand for an explanation, only embrace. The younger son tried to speak through his tears. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." He had planned to say more. "Make me as one of your hired servants." But the father did not let him finish, because the father had not been waiting for a servant. He had been waiting for a son. He turned toward the servants who had gathered near the road, stunned by what they were witnessing. "Bring the best robe," the father said. "Put it on him. Place a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet." The younger son lowered his head in disbelief. A robe to cover shame, a ring to restore identity, sandals for feet that had walked through ruin. Every gift spoke louder than words. You are not merely tolerated, you are restored. Then the father said, "Prepare the feast. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found." Soon, the house that had carried silence for so long filled with movement. Bread was prepared, lamps were lit, music rose into the evening air. But the younger son stood quietly at the edge of it all, overwhelmed. The home he once thought too small now felt vast with mercy. The father he once left behind now seemed greater than he had ever understood. And the peace he once rejected returned not as something he deserved, but as a gift. That night, as the celebration began, the younger son sat beneath the light of the lamps and looked around the room. Everything was familiar, yet everything was different, because he was different. The journey had taken him through pride, hunger, shame, and loneliness. But somehow, through mercy, it had brought him home. And perhaps that is what grace does. It does not erase the road a man has walked, but it makes return possible, even after everything. The older brother heard the music before he saw the house. He had been working in the fields when the sound reached him across the evening air. Laughter, instruments, voices raised in celebration. He stopped walking. His hands were tired from labor. Dust clung to his clothes. Sweat cooled against his skin as the sun lowered beyond the hills. A servant passed nearby, and the older brother called to him. "What is happening?" The servant smiled, unaware of the storm forming in the man before him. "Your brother has returned," he said, "and your father has prepared a feast, because he received him back safe." For a moment, the older brother said nothing. Then his face hardened. "Your brother." The words struck him like an insult. He had not thought of the younger man as his brother for a long time. Not since the day the inheritance was taken. Not since the day his father's heart was wounded. Not since he had stayed behind and carried responsibilities that were no longer shared. Anger rose inside him. Not sudden anger, old anger. The kind that had been buried beneath years of obedience. He stood outside the house, refusing to enter. Inside, the celebration continued. Music, joy, restoration. But to the older brother, it sounded like injustice. His father came out to him. That alone should have softened him. The father, once again, leaving the celebration to seek a son standing outside. But resentment is a heavy veil. It makes love difficult to recognize. The older brother spoke with bitterness. All these years I have served you. I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me even a young goat to celebrate with my friends. His voice trembled, not only with anger, with hurt. But when this son of yours comes back after wasting your property, you kill the fattened calf for him. This son of yours, not my brother. That is what bitterness does. It separates people before they ever speak aloud. The father listened. He did not shame him. He did not dismiss his pain, because the older brother's wound was real too. He had stayed. He had worked. He had obeyed. But somewhere along the way, duty had become resentment, and obedience without love had hardened his heart. The father answered gently, "My son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours." The words were simple, but deep. The older brother had lived near the father while feeling far from him. He had remained in the house, yet somehow missed the heart of the home. That is another kind of lostness. Not the lostness of distant cities and reckless living, but the lostness of standing close to mercy while refusing to rejoice in it. The father continued, "It was right that we should celebrate, for your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." The older brother looked toward the house, toward the music, toward the brother he had judged as unworthy, and the story leaves him there, at the doorway, neither inside nor fully gone, because the final question is not only whether the younger son will return, it is whether the older son will enter joy. And so the story ends not with a closed door, but with an open one, a father celebrating, a younger son restored, an older son standing outside, wrestling with his own heart. Perhaps that is why this parable remains so powerful. It does not allow us to look only at one person. It asks us to look at ourselves. Because at different moments in life, we may find ourselves in every part of this story. Sometimes we are the younger son, restless, hungry for something more, convinced that peace is too small for us. We leave what is good because we believe something greater is waiting somewhere else. We chase approval, excitement, pleasure, success, or freedom without boundaries. And for a while, it may even feel like life, until the noise fades, until the money ends, until the people disappear, until silence finally shows us what our distractions were hiding. Have you ever chased something that promised life, but left you emptier than before? Have you ever mistaken attention for love? Have you ever walked away from peace because it seemed too ordinary? And sometimes we are the older brother. We stay, we work, we do what is is expected. But deep inside, resentment begins to grow. We compare. We measure. We wonder why others receive mercy after making mistakes we tried so hard to avoid. And slowly, goodness becomes performance. Obedience becomes bitterness. Faith becomes a transaction. Have you ever done the right thing while your heart was far from love? Have you ever struggled to rejoice when someone else received grace? Have you ever believed that being faithful should protect you from feeling unseen? This story speaks to both kinds of lostness, the one that wanders far away, and the one that remains close, yet does not know the Father's heart. But above both sons stands the Father, waiting, watching, running, inviting. The Father does not deny sin. He does not call destruction harmless. He does not pretend the younger son's choices caused no pain. But his mercy is greater than shame. His love moves first, before the speech is finished, before the son can earn his place, before restoration makes sense to anyone watching. That is the heart of the parable. A man may travel far from God, but he is not beyond the reach of grace. So perhaps tonight, this story leaves you with a question. Where are you standing? Are you still on the road away from home? Are you sitting in silence, finally realizing the world cannot heal your heart? Are you walking back, afraid you are no longer worthy? Or are you standing outside the feast, unable to forgive the mercy given to someone else? The answer does not need to be spoken aloud. Let it rest quietly in your heart. Because some questions are not meant to be answered quickly. They are meant to follow us into silence. And maybe, somewhere in that silence, we begin to hear the Father calling us home.